Hello, my name is Neil Davies, University of California, Berkeley, and I'd like to share some thoughts on extraction, data, and value in the context of scientific research. Just a bit on my background. I'm a geneticist and evolutionary biologist by training. For the last 20 years, I have been director of the University of California's Gump South Pacific Research Station on the island of Moorea in French Polynesia, and more recently a senior fellow at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. The Gump Station supports research on land and sea, spanning physical, biological, and social sciences, as well as the humanities. So, for example, we host the only coral reef site in the United States National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research network. That's a network of place-based programs collecting the highest quality time series data across different ecosystem types. The goal is to understand how these types respond to human activities and environmental change. The Gump Station is located on Polynesian land called Atiti'a, and since 2002, half the property is managed by the Tahitian community-based organization Tepu Atiti'a, which is focused on traditional knowledge, culture, and educational programs. With the Gump Station and Atiti'a Center side by side, we have a unique opportunity to explore synergies and mutualistic feedbacks between local traditional knowledge and global scientific understanding. Essentially, we ask how can we collaborate to promote sustainable development at nested scales of social ecological organization. Okay, so that's a bit of background. Now I'd like to talk about data, how we generate or extract it, and how its use is or might be organized. First of all, it's almost a cliche to say that data is the new oil of the global economy, but it's probably not an exaggeration to claim that the most valuable resource we will extract from natural systems in the 21st century is indeed data. So more precisely, I want to address scientific data, by which I mean well-described or well-contextualized data, which in technical jargon means rich metadata, data about data. On its own, for example, a genetic sequence is just a string of A, C's, T's, and G's, and is relatively meaningless. It is in the metadata, where the gene was found, in which species, and under what conditions the gene might be expressed, that real value is found. So most human cultures have long recognized that everything is connected, although science has tended to forget this in more recent decades in our pursuit of a reductionist approach and attempting to remove human biases from experiments. However, as we enter what some call the fourth industrial revolution, Moore's law, the acceleration of computer power, and the advent of the internet mean that the world is becoming more and more interconnected, and science is able to investigate this complexity directly thanks to new digital sensing capacities, digital communications, and high-performance computing. So one example here is a global fishing watch, which demonstrates the power of this fusion of the physical, biological, and social or digital world. So through satellites and other observing systems, we're now able to track vessels across the global ocean and use computer algorithms, so-called machine learning or artificial intelligence, AI, to calculate automatically which vessels are fishing. These data can then be combined with fisheries data to design more sustainable management strategies across the world and to monitor their implementation. But machines, even intelligent ones, are not built with all the answers preloaded. They need to learn just like humans do, and just as we need books and libraries, machines need well-described data. Recognizing this, governments around the world seeking to develop AI as a new industry have been recommending the creation of open data standards and repositories or trusts that provide access for machines to high-quality data sets. Now, one of the most influential efforts in this direction is known as the Fair Data Principles, which enhance the ability of machines to find and use data across different domains and sectors. As with many technology-driven trends, however, it is important to consider who benefits and whether the current institutional frameworks are fair in the sense of equity and justice. Certainly there are reasons to hope that open data combined with advanced computing, could help solve many of the greatest challenges that society faces, albeit recognizing that technology can also help explain how we ended up facing those challenges in the first place. One example I'll develop a little bit more detail here is environmental sustainability, which is arguably the major challenge of the Anthropocene, certainly the 21st century. So to address this challenge, we need information and global models of the entire planet to understand global processes like climate change and ocean acidification. But we also need to know how organisms respond to these changes and feed back into the system. So in ocean acidification, for example, how does the calcification process respond at the molecular level to lower pH in different species of coral? In other words, we have to study the Earth from genome up and from planet down. Now that's a vastly complex task, but we've addressed overwhelming complexity before in science, for example in biomedicine, where the focus is the human organism. And we've made great progress by reducing the complexity through simpler model organisms that are more tractable. For example, C. elegans nematode or the fruit fly. So we're doing the same thing in some of our research programs. Instead of going from genome to planet, however, we've simplified it by going from the genome up to the size and scale of a small island. So for the last number of years, an international consortium, the IDEA consortium, has been working to build digital representations, avatars, if you like, of islands, in this case Moorea, to simulate the entire social ecological system under alternate scenarios of environmental change and human activities. The idea is that such scenario-based planning tools can help local communities make the high-dimensional decisions they need to make to navigate their way to resilient futures. These environmental place-based avatars are similar to efforts at other scales, sometimes known as digital twins, where copies of machines, buildings, or people are simulated in silico to aid in their design or maintenance or healthcare. So in other words, the so-called fourth industrial revolution is building a new digital or virtual world, or maybe worlds, in cyberspace inspired by, if not directly copying, elements of our existing world. Building the virtual world requires extraction of materials in the real one, from the real one rather, and the provision of energy. The contents of cyberspace, however, are digital and therefore can be used over and over again, non-rivalrous, which raises fundamental questions about what political economy could work in such an intangible world. And of course, the cyberspace is still intimately linked with the physical world, with us, and it is influenced by us, but it also, like our physical environment, shapes us, and increasingly so. How this digital new world is governed and how does it relate to the physical world are major, perhaps existential issues. So tackling these issues addresses deep philosophical challenges and is strewn with loaded terms. I'm a mere biologist, so I'm wary about treading on these grounds, but I'm going to risk blundering into the minefield, and I'll consider two of these terms, extraction and enclosure. So my simplistic sense of what extraction means, when I was first asked about this session, is to remove something from its context. I looked that up in the dictionary and found I'd missed a significant qualification, that this usually requires effort or force. So that was interesting and led me to make this little graphic here. Science is increasingly sampling the world towards the more renewable end of the spectrum and digitizing objects as quickly as possible. Indeed, the preference is to digitize samples before they're extracted, which is really more copying or imaging than what might be considered extracting if we use the dictionary's force criterion. Genetic science, for example, sits somewhere in the middle here, We can't read genetic sequences remotely from satellites, so we still need to physically access organisms and remove molecules. But we can rapidly sequence very small amounts of material, literally only a few molecules, with little or no long-term impact to the ecosystem. These systems regrow and regenerate, and so it can be a very minimal impact. And it remains questionable then whether we should be considering this end, and what increasingly science does, whether we should call the extraction of digital data extraction, or is it copying, imaging, some other term? It's possible that extraction can happen entirely within a place. It's not always about necessarily removing it and taking it somewhere else. For example, putting a fence around a field effectively extracts that field from the rest of the prairie. This creation of barriers, however, is more often called enclosure, and enclosure can be applied to any extracted entity or as part of the extraction itself. Open science obviously seeks to prevent enclosure. So remember, the FAIR principles aim to promote access to extracted samples or data sets. But this raises challenges too. Extraction always requires some effort, even if it doesn't require force. Some effort is needed to isolate something. And without enclosure, is there any incentive to exert this effort? That is an economic question. If data or knowledge can be copied at zero marginal cost, it can be hard to enclose or to justify not sharing freely. Of course, the problem is the cost of the first copy is not zero, and free riders can undermine the motivation of others to work or invest to create knowledge in the first place, or to add value to existing knowledge. The solution has been to create artificial scarcity through enclosure or intellectual property rights, or as Abraham Lincoln put it, to add the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. But again, this system can be gamed, and rewarding those for the value they add risks overshooting and giving them monopoly over more than just the amount they contributed. Rooting out these monopoly profits, or rents, is one of the main tasks of modern governments, or at least it should be. So I want to finish with a few thoughts on how some of this applies to research that I've been involved in on genetic resources. And that research is really a key step to building predictive models of entire social ecological systems, as I mentioned earlier, because to do that we really need a parts list. It's hard to understand a system if you don't have a good idea about what all the parts are that make up that system. So in the case of an island like Moorea, this means, among other things, a list of all the species. And very few places have a list of all the species, especially once you get into the very small and microbial realm. So we began assembling a comprehensive list in 2008 through the Moorea Biocode project, which was an international program supported by over $5 million from the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, to digitally image and genetically sequence all of the animals and plants from the reefs to the mountaintops of the island. So we were doing this prior to the Convention on Biological Diversity developing the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. But in sequencing every species on an island, we were very aware of the need to ensure that this benefited local people as well as global science. And we contributed at the time to reflections leading to the Nagoya Protocol, particularly on how access and benefit sharing should be organized with respect to non-commercial scientific research, the research that aims to contribute knowledge that would be a global public good accessible to all. So fair is fair in that sense. So surely this should be a win-win for all and fast-tracked in comparison to research motivated by private gain. So that was the argument from the non-commercial research community. A couple of anecdotes here shows how some of my simplistic thinking evolved in this respect, with some interaction with the real world of how this all works. And First example is an assumption that open science is a global good, and so everyone should support it. It turns out that's not quite so straightforward. Most diverse places, for example, have less capital than other parts of the world, and so they cannot benefit as much from open data or from exploiting public available resources on their biodiversity. And so they might have an incentive, a perfectly rational one, to limit access to their biodiversity until they have built up the capacity to profit from it themselves. Of course, that's rational, but it must also be weighed against the fact that in the meantime, the whole world is deprived of those data, and that might lead to major advances being delayed, including advances that would benefit the provider country. So imagine, for example, a vaccine to COVID-19. We would not want to have to wait decades for all countries' infrastructure to equilibrate before we could take advantage of a solution like that. Second, it seemed obvious to me at the time that if your research was fast-tracked because your intent was to put it in the public domain, then seeking intellectual property like a patent would breach those terms. But in fact, it isn't quite so simple. If researchers have to return to providers to negotiate commercial terms when they find an unexpected commercial opportunity, many might find that too costly and decide to simply publish their results and move on. Once in the public domain, nobody then can apply for a patent. So in this case, perhaps providers should have been considering patent applications not as commercial activity, but encouraging researchers to apply for patents whenever possible, but not to license or otherwise commercialize them without negotiating terms first. And basically, the lesson here is that open science is not always necessarily good for everyone. Life is complicated, much more so than my two simple anecdotes there. But we really need to consider who benefits and think through the arrangements to ensure that fair is fair. So to conclude, I'd like to express a little hope. In our work on rare with community experts and international scientists, we often find synergies. In particular, we're all passionate about context. We want to maintain context. Data can now be transmitted immediately anywhere on Earth. That's a wonderful thing, connecting humanity, but also makes it very easy to pluck something out of context, expropriation if you like, and transmit it to people and places where the context cannot be easily inferred, and its meaning can often be misinterpreted, and sometimes with potentially dangerous results. Fake news is one example of this. Sometimes it's deliberate, often accidental. And this emphasizes really that meaning and value lies not so much in the nodes, but in the connections, in the links between data and between people. So that's why scientists value model systems so much, because those systems allow us to keep a maximum amount of the context in place, including as we transfer it into the silicon world, digital world. So we can have a holistic understanding of how everything is connected and what changes to one part of the system might mean for others. So such knowledge is essential for justice and equity. And finally, we all recognize the importance of collaboration within and between places, and how necessary that is if we want to learn and learn how to live better. Local systems are increasingly exposed to regional or global change, and we need to understand what change is coming, how our local systems might respond to that change, how they could be fortified to increase resilience. And for this, we need to learn from others, maybe others who've experienced some of those changes already and have lessons that can be applied elsewhere, and maybe have developed solutions that can be shared. And we also want to start to use digital tools to try out strategies and run scenarios in silico, in the virtual world, so we can learn from mistakes we make there to guide our decisions here in the real world and move us more towards a sustainable future. Okay, thanks so much.